White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders and former White House Press Secretary Mike McCurry talked about the relationship between the press and the presidency. This was hosted by the White House Correspondents Association. It's 50 Minutes.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Margaret Tollive. I'm the president of the White House Correspondents Association. I cover the White House for Bloomberg. And I just wanted to welcome everybody to tonight's fantastic program and to thank, of course, our esteemed panel here. And all of you know how great Martha Kumar is, but let me take a moment to thank Martha for all that she does for us in terms of her scholarship and her research. She is a constant resource for all of us who cover the White House and for any of the American public who's interested in the presidency and the operations inside that building. I also want to thank the White House Historical Association for your generosity and your support of our programs and of Martha's work and of all of our study and common interest in the presidency. And just before I turn things over to Martha, to mention that last night the WHCA was in Independence, Missouri at the Truman Library for what we hope will be the first of many partnerships and events with presidential libraries and museums across the country, talking with Americans outside of the Beltway and answering their questions about the presidency, the press, and the interaction between the two. We got a ton of questions and a ton of interest, and it may mirror many of our questions in this room tonight, but we just wanted to let all of you know that if this is an enterprise you are interested in, anyone watching, if you want us to come to your hometown, let us know. We'll get to work on it. We'll be at the Reagan Library in May as well. And without further ado, none of these people needs any introduction, but I will turn it over to Martha. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margaret. I really appreciate it. I'm Martha Kumar, and I'm the director of the White House Transition Project, which is a co-sponsor with the Correspondents Association. We are a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization of political scientists who study the presidency, who study the White House, and prepare information for people coming into the White House. Steve Thoma, the executive director of the White House Correspondents Association, and Margaret have done a great deal, yes, to, working together for this program, but also working together for access to information and getting what they think the public needs. I also like to thank Terry Sullivan, who's the executive director of the White House Transition Project, who worked on event preparations as well. The genesis of the panels is a belief out there that the briefing is the place where reporters get all of their information, and that a lot of people think that it's useless. And we're going to show the many ways in which the briefing is important to reporters, it's important to the public, and important to the president as well. In the first panel, we have Sarah Sanders and Mike McCurry, who are going to talk about being press secretaries and the role of the briefing and also the role of the press secretary. And then there's going to be a panel of reporters who are going to talk about where they get their information so that you can see it's more than just the briefing. And the reporters are going to be Peter Baker of the New York Times, Steve Holland of Reuters, Margaret, as president of the association, will talk about access, and Alexis Simendinger of The Hill is going to moderate that. So let's begin. And in looking at the briefing, let's start with you, Mike, because you brought the televised briefing.
So it's all your fault. Yeah.
A bad thing.
So why did you bring television cameras in, and what did you see as the uses for the briefing? How is it useful to reporters, to the president, the staff, and also to the public?
Well, let me step back for a second. The idea that the President of the United States has someone on his or her behalf every day to stand up and be accountable and to answer questions, and sometimes they are vigorous and not exactly the questions that the White House wants to hear every day, but that is a really, really important part of our process. And the respect for that and the respect for what we call the fourth estate in the media is very important. I don't want to put you on the spot, but they are not the enemy of the people. They are a critical part of the way in which we come to understand what is our government really trying to do each and every day. But to your question, I had been at the State Department in the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, 93, 94. We had televised briefings there, and I got to the White House and they said, well, you know, like they don't televise the briefings. I said, well, you know what, that's BS. Why don't we, you know, why don't we just like change the rules and you can, you know, no problem. That was fine up until Monica Lewinsky. But I think some of the folks here will remember that, you know, I wish that I had put in place a rule that we had at the State Department, which is you don't live broadcast these things because they are raw material for journalists who are trying to gather information about the White House. They are not news events. I mean, you now have to go out and it's a news event.
Say that one again.
Well, I mean, you know, it's treated now as a entertainment product on cable television, and that's not what the White House briefing was supposed to be. It's a briefing. It's like you get this information, the White House puts out what it wants to think. You, as reporters, many of you here, go check that against other sources, and then you report and give us, the American people, a more valid report. When it becomes a live TV production every day, it becomes something else than what a briefing is supposed to be. So I very much regret that I did not put some restrictions on how that briefing would happen every day, which I would simply said, I would have said it's embargoed until after it's over. So then it's not live, you can't put it on live, you have to kind of like go out and report. You can go report live after, but it would have been a different kind of event if it had not been sort of a theater production every day. And that was, I regret that mistake, but the cat's out of the barn on that. It's not going to change. You're going to have to go live every day. That's the way it is. And you know, as part of this is the change in the media, the change in the immediacy of where, you know, social media gets stuff, and it's a part of the change. Remember, as my daughter reminds me, she said, "Dad, yeah, you were a big shot, but it was like in the last century." And she's right about that, because in the you know, when we were doing this, we didn't have social media, we didn't have Facebook, Twitter, all the things that you have to contend with now. So it was a different environment. But I think if I had thought it through more carefully, I think I would have established different ground rules and different ways in which people could assess the information they get in that briefing, because it's become something that it should not be if we are interested in just keeping the public informed about what are the critical things that they need to know about the president's decisions and the White House. That's not a popular view among some of you here, I know, but that is the way I think about it.
That's right. I'm used to not always being the most popular person in the room.
I think it's pretty inevitable, though, that it would go live. And it wouldn't have taken long before it did.
Yeah, but we had good rules at the State Department, which is you didn't go live with it until after the briefing was over. And it gave journalists a chance to assess what was really newsworthy that came out of this that the people needed to know. But now it's it's theater, and you have to perform every day. You always look very good.
Thank you.
I like your pearls. But it becomes it's theater, and it's not a briefing. And that concerns me a lot, because what we need is more transparency, more access to information, more of the public sort of hearing what needs to be happening. It's fine. I mean, C-SPAN is here tonight, and we love them because they used to actually take the briefing and put it on late at night. So if someone wanted to see the whole briefing, they could see the whole briefing. But it was not, this kind of like rat-a-tat-tat stuff that goes on now.
What do you think about the impact of the briefing on the White House staff and on the president? That the briefing has been important also for letting them know what issues are important, what things can't be avoided, what the priorities are. In some ways, it's an early warning system, so that having the president watch the briefing lets him know what's going on. Did President Clinton watch it?
Thankfully not, but I will turn it over to Sarah at this point,
Yes.
because I think her president probably is more attuned to it.
Sarah, what do you see the uses of the briefing being?
My experience is obviously a little bit different than Mike's. I agree that I think that the purpose of the briefing, particularly how it was originally intended, was meant to inform the public by way, one, of informing the public, but two, informing the press that then writes about it to further disseminate information. I think it's still a very useful tool. I do agree that I think a lot of times the theatrics of it take away from the news component. I think most people at home don't care about a lot of the issues that we spend most of our time talking about in the briefings. I've said that before. I'm sure that's not going to be a very popular answer here. But a lot of times we have topics that are make for better TV than they do for informing the policy and the substance of what's actually taking place at the White House. I think if there was a way to have a lot more substance in the briefings, I do think it would be better for the American people. I know that kind of to echo the point that Mike made, when the cameras were off, there was a brief period. I'm not advocating for the cameras going off. I do think that there is a certain element of transparency in having them on, but I can tell you the amount of substance was much higher, and the type of questions and the tone of the questions was very different in the time period where the cameras, from our administration in the past year, in the time period where the cameras were off, than on the days that they're on. Again, I'm not advocating that we turn them off, because I agree that there is something nice for the American public to be able to see that interaction. But I do think that if we had a little bit more substance, it would benefit all of us a little bit. And certainly the White House perspective, and I think even the media would benefit from it, because I think there are a lot of serious journalists and serious reporters that show up to work every day and actually try to put out good information. And I think if there was more of that exchange and more substance discussed, then I think it would benefit both sides a lot better.
Martha, a quick point on that. In the history of televised briefings, it began with Hott and Carter in the 1970s during the Iran hostage crisis. He first allowed televised briefings at the State Department. And they developed a practice. There would be a live briefing, and then the reporters would gather up around for an on-background session, which was a little bit artificial because it was still, you know, people could tell who was doing the briefing and who was the senior administration official doing the briefing. But there was a way to kind of get the public information that they needed to have that was not consumed in this theater of the televised briefing. And I wish there was more. Now, part of that is, I'll put the iron to you here. You have got to have an administration that's committed to respect the role of the free press. You cannot have a president who declares them to be the enemy and who goes out and describes them as fake news every day. I think that does not create the environment in which we have the kind of exchange we're talking about. But, you know, part of that is political theater. And if we can get away from political theater and get back to the idea the public has a right to know. They have a right to know what their government is doing, and there needs to be access to the information that we need to have. There need to be different ways of conveying that information. And, you know, a live televised briefing at the White House is not, it may be entertainment for cable television news in the afternoon, but it maybe is not the best way to kind of get the public the information they need. So as long as you are like working to get critical information in front of the public and working with reporters who are asking about this report or that report, who sometimes actually, many of you here in the audience here don't even go to the briefing because you say that's not the best use of my time. My best use of my time is actually going and doing the work of reporting that I need to do day in and day out. If you're working with them and creating the kind of environment in which you're, you know, helping them get access to the information they need, then I think we end up in a better place at the end of the day. I'm not trying to be critical of.
Maybe.
One of the ways, one of the things that you all did, particularly in, I would say, the first maybe 6 months or 9 months of the administration, was to have briefings by administration officials and have them come into the briefing room. And so the reporters who were in the briefing room could ask questions, and it was not televised. And those were very informative sessions, and ones where I thought the A-team of reporters came. They all knew that that was an opportunity, whether it was to talk to McMaster or Tillerson or Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, all those people cycled through. And there was a lot of information that was in those briefings. And you all still do some, but they are, you know, low key, but information rich.
You know, it's interesting that you brought that up. We still do a number of those, but we also, a lot of times we'll have people come in on the front end of the briefing because we know there are a lot more reporters and we can get that information out there. What I've found to be incredibly interesting, because those are very substantive and very policy driven, it's interesting that rarely do all of the cable networks cover that first part of the briefing. On most occasions when I come in, I'll do an opening and then I will introduce a cabinet level official or a subject matter expert. The cables will cut away and don't come back until the fun really begins of the Q&A. And I think that's the exact point I was making, is that we have, and I think certainly it echoes exactly what Mike was saying, is we have lost the purpose of what the briefing was intended to be. It was meant to inform the public. It was meant to inform reporters so that they could further inform the public. And we are getting further and further away from that component, particularly when the most substantive parts of the briefing are the parts that are the least covered. Those are not the pieces you ever see played over and over again, and rarely are they even covered at all on the front end of the briefing. And I think that's a real missed opportunity by the press, but I also think it's a real disservice to the American people, and I think that's why you will see some frustration from this administration. We could not support or want to be bigger advocates of the First Amendment, but I do think there is a level of responsibility that comes with being a journalist. And like I said a few minutes ago, I think that the majority of the people that show up every day come for the purpose of good reporting and wanting to do their job, but there are a handful of people that I don't think are as responsible with that information, and that I think can be very inaccurate at times and put out misleading information. And I do think that that is problematic. And one of the other problems that you see is that now just anybody with a phone or a computer will call themselves reporters. And I think that is a challenge that actual journalists have to kind of fight with. We have a lot of people that apply for passes to come to the press briefing that may not actually have a true outlet that they are writing, but we allow all of those individuals to come in to ask questions. And I think that that's a challenge that a lot of reporters face, is kind of fighting between real reporters and real journalists and people that may have a blog, and those two things, there's a really blurry line between them now, and I think a lot of times the real news component gets lost in that shuffle.
What,
I want to comment on that. I really do believe, I did the same thing. We sometimes brought into the White House, we actually did these briefings, Martha, you remember, sometimes before foreign trips, we would actually bring into the briefing room historians or other people who had no connection to the White House. They were just knowledgeable about the countries that we were visiting, or the G8 or something like that. And then we would bring them in. I'll have to confess, sometimes that was for me stalling until I had the answers to the questions that I knew were going to be the real questions at the briefing every day. But
don't tell them all of our tactics, Mark.
I
We
know.
gotta have a little bit of
But
kidding.
at the end of the day, we knew that we had to be accountable, and we had to go out there and we had to deal with the press every day. You cannot do this job in an environment in which you're belligerent and saying we're at war with these people every day in the media.
I don't think I've ever said anything similar to that.
No, you haven't, and you get great credit from a lot of the people here from being amicable and dealing with them, but your president has got to change the way he talks about the media. He has to, because it's critical to how we hold our glue together and how our democracy functions, and he's creating an environment in which it's hard for people to do this transaction of getting the public the information they need to have, and for us to go out and do the job that we have to do, which is to take the hard questions, to get beat up by the press, which I understand, that's part of the job, but it has to come from some level of respect that there is a critical role there. And the president's comments sometimes sort of seem that he doesn't really respect what that critical relationship is about. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
A two-way street, that there is a level of respect that could be, I think, certainly brought from the press corps as well. I mean, the idea that this is, you're going to lay the blame at the feet of the president, I find to be a little bit far-fetched. And again, I know that's probably not very popular in this room, but we do the very best we can to go out and actually present information. But a lot of times, frankly, the press doesn't care about it. They don't care about the information that we're putting out there, and they would rather talk about palace intrigue stories, and I find that to be a real disservice.
I know, but that's not dissimilar from what I went through. I mean, every White House
I've looked
has had
at the
that.
numbers, and I do think that
I mean,
the amount of
go back to
negative
Thomas
coverage-
Jefferson.
Yeah. No, I mean, the historical numbers don't lie. 90% of the coverage about this president is negative. When
Yeah,
at the
but
same
that's
time,
because 90% of what he's done that people have
that's
questions
just not
about.
true. when this country is actually doing really well. There's a lot of success stories out of the first year of this administration, and that when you have that much positive news to talk about and only 10% of the time it's covered, I think that it's hard to argue that there shouldn't be a certain level of frustration.
Look, I had that frustration, and every president has.
Be glad that your numbers were better, because I've looked at those too.
Well, if you want to think Bill Clinton had, Bill Clinton had a great liberal press.
His share of scandal there, so I think it's fair to say you had to weather the storm as well.
If you thought Bill Clinton had the liberal press on his side all the time, I wish they had showed up more often to be supportive of me. So we all go through this.
And I'm not denying that there isn't a natural level of tension between the press and the White House. That's always existed.
Right, but the difference is, we still understood and respected that they were the fourth estate, and that they were there, and that we had to deal with them because they were the conduit which we kept the American people informed, and for better or worse, and some days we were going to get the worst rather than the better, but we did not declare war on them.
And we have not declared war on the press.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. And that's a big, big difference. And you need to roll that back. You got to get the president. You can't do it, but the president has got to roll that back.
One thing the president has been doing is speaking regularly to the press.
He does more, by the way, I know where you're going with this. He is more accessible in doing the exchanges, and you're the master of the data on all this. He's probably been more accessible than either Obama or Clinton, correct?
Oh, well,
in the exchange,
Clinton in the first year before you got there.
You mean when we stopped letting him do interviews at McDonald's?
Yeah, Clinton talked
for a jog in the morning.
That's right. Jefferson Memorial. He stops at the Jefferson Memorial or up on Capitol Hill, and reporters got him. But President Trump does do a lot of short Q&As.
And that's the form now. Like the whole, like how many press conferences do you do at night is something that's kind of an artificial measure compared to your measure, which is like when do you interact with the press and get actually real questions.
Which I think, just to jump in, which I think argues the point that you were making, that you don't have somebody who is accessible and being held accountable by the press. By the definition of the fact that he spends as much time interacting with the press as he does, I think it's hard to argue that he isn't open to answering those questions and being held accountable by the press. And so I think that's a very big difference, and one of the things that's regularly left out of conversations is how accessible this president is and how often he interacts with the press, but also how often he interacts with the American public in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
So it didn't exist when you guys were in office. That makes things very different, which I think it makes it really hard to compare apples to apples from administration to administration, because we're dealing with a whole lot of things that didn't even exist when you guys were in office. And so some of the comments on Twitter and Facebook from both sides, I think, create a different element, a different environment that makes it really hard to compare the two administrations.
You know, so Martha, I know you have good questions, but I think but she just made a very, very important point, which is the job that I had back in the 1990s versus what Sarah has to do now is totally different because of social media, because of the immediacy of 24/7 stuff. I mean, we didn't have to deal with a lot of that. We could actually plan a news cycle that would have a rhythm to it. And poor Sarah has got 24/7. You're up all night and probably up early in the morning.
Some due to the reporter, some due to kids. Balance.
But it's a different, the job is different. And because of the changes that we've seen in technology and social media and the ways in which the media covers the White House. And, I keep saying this, that, to my friends in the media, many of whom are here, the competition in the business model of journalism has been speed. How fast can you break the story? Who can get the breaking news fastest? And I wish that we would slow it down and de-accelerate and sort of say who can get it right and who can get it most substantive, and where can we go that we know, well, I've heard all this stuff splatter across the internet, but I really want to know where can I go to get the real truth about what's going on. And that is a brand of journalism that I think people would invest in. Mm-hmm. Now, I may be naive about that, but I honestly do believe that we need to reinvent what the business model is for the economics of journalism, because, you know, a lot of you are working for news organizations that are plundering, and they're going out of business, and they're not getting advertising rates, and, you know, you're not going to have jobs. So, like, why don't you reinvent your profession and do something that will actually make a difference at the end of the day?
And I think, too, a lot of times, to echo on what you're saying, because there's such a race to be first, that you do have inaccuracies are going to be more often. Right. Because the level of speed, and I think that goes back to the point that I was making, you are dealing with that same level of speed so often. Something that was meant to just get out there quickly and it may not be accurate can drive news for days, because the story with the inaccuracies runs on the front page and the correction runs on the back page of the C-section. And so a lot of times you don't see the real reporting come through when there's such a race to be first.
Of course, I also did not have a president who tweeted at 7 o'clock in the morning. So that makes
I can only imagine what the Clinton administration with Twitter could have looked like. and maybe it's safe for us not to do that.
Well, you know, that's actually a very good point. Like, if you're a White House reporter, what could be better than to have an opportunity to wake up every day at 6:30 in the morning and know exactly what is on the president's mind? You didn't have that with Bill Clinton. You didn't have that with Barack Obama, but you do have that with Donald Trump. You know exactly what he's thinking about and what is motivating him, for better or worse. Now, I personally, unfortunately, think some of it has been for the worse, but, you know, on the other hand, as a question of how do you cover the White House and how do you understand what motivates the president, I mean, this guy is giving you raw material that is unprecedented in the history of how we cover the White House. If you're a White House reporter, I will refrain from partisan comment about what I think of it, but on the other hand, you cannot claim that it's not giving you more transparency and more.
Yes.
Definitely gives them a lot more stories.
We know our president well.
Well, it gives stories, but it also, as you know, when you're trying to develop themes and trying to get, you know, it's so hard to communicate from the White House and develop consistent storylines that will get people engaged in what you're doing. You get these constant rabbits going out off the trail, and then you don't get, you know, you lose track of how you kind of keep coherent. And I think that's the problem you have, is the ability to be coherent and to kind of keep driving central messages that are going to be important that you have to reinforce, because people have to hear it over and over again. If they don't hear it, you know, if they hear it one time, it's not going to count. They have to hear it over and over again. But when the president sends out rabbits on the trail and down the hole they go, then you're off dealing with whatever you have to deal with every day.
Well, if the briefing has not provided the kind of information to reporters that you want them to get, the messages that you want them to get, you were available in many other ways to reporters. You do bring in people. You serve as a facilitator to help reporters get information from people, and then you during the afternoon you're always available. to reporters. So can you talk about those ways in which you inform reporters? That the idea that everything comes out of the briefing is not accurate. There are many ways that Sarah is providing information. And can you talk about some of those?
Sure. I would say actually the briefing is probably one of the smaller information out. We spend a lot of time, there are a number of people on the press staff that regularly talk and visit with reporters. As I look around the room, several of these people were in my office at some point today, and certainly pretty regularly, and walking through maybe the details of a story or helping provide information. Sometimes it's bringing in a subject matter expert or just facilitating them talking to somebody within the administration that can go more in depth on a specific policy. But we do that a lot. Most of the time, I'd love to say that the first thing that wakes me up is either one of my kids or even Twitter for that matter, but it's usually calls starting around 5 o'clock in the morning from all of the morning show correspondents and stuff that are getting ready for hits that want to talk about, you know, the different events of the day or whatever else it may be, the news that's happening, or they want more detailed information about what the president's doing at a particular event or follow up from the night before. And so it starts pretty early with a lot of phone calls, and that usually doesn't stop until well into the evening, both, you know, phone, email. And frankly, we found that sometimes the fastest way to get information to a large number of reporters very quickly is to use Twitter. You know, sometimes, for instance, last week when the president was going to make a statement regarding the horrific tragedy in Florida, I put that out via Twitter because I knew it was the fastest way to let the press, who many have asked earlier that day at what time the president will speak. And so there are a lot of different tools that we use in order to engage with the press. And we do our very best to make sure anytime a member of the press has a question that we respond. Sometimes it's to say that we don't have a lot of information to give, but in some way to respond to them. Our goal, certainly within our office, and the instruction that I've given is anytime you receive a question, respond back, even if it's to let them know that we don't have any information for them. I'm actually probably the worst offender, and there's probably people nodding in the crowd of maybe not always responding to email, because I often get pulled into meetings and come back to, it's a blessing and a curse to have email. I'll come back and, you know, there may be 200 or 300 emails that I've received over the course of a couple of hours that I haven't responded to, and so getting back through can sometimes be a challenge. But we try to use every tool available, and I'm incredibly grateful to have an amazing team I get to work with that helps facilitate and handle a lot of the requests that we get daily from the press.
Yeah, Martha, on that point, there's another untapped resource, which is in the federal government, in all of the agencies that we have a lot of people employed as public information officers. And I get reminded that anytime, you know, have you met Marlon Fitzwater yet, one of our predecessors?
No, but I have the book.
Yeah, he's got Call the Briefing. It's a very good book. But he was a public information officer and worked in the federal government for a long time. And there are a lot of people who work in the federal government whose job it is to keep the public informed. And I thought about this a lot. A lot of the, you know, day-to-day reporting on the federal government funnels through the White House. If we could funnel it back out to where these agencies are actually doing incredibly good work on behalf of the American people, and we need to put a spotlight on it. If we could figure out how to do that, I think that would be to everyone's benefit. So, you know, like elevating those folks and letting them talk. You know, they all cower because they're afraid that the White House is going to come down on them if they do their thing. But you know, there are a lot of people with a lot of good access to resources and information that we ought to empower to be more communicative. And that, you know.
I wonder what, in terms of the information that you're going to that provide, where does the president come into your preparation for the briefing? Do you see him before the briefing? How many times a day do you see him? And when he talks to you, does he tell you what he wants to say and also how to say it?
No 2 days are really alike. A lot of times it depends on what's happening that day, what the news of the day is. I typically, every day that there's an on-camera briefing, I will talk to the president before I go out. I usually have a few questions that I have a pretty good feeling will come up, and I try to ask and make sure I have answers to those. And sometimes I don't ask all of the questions that they will later ask, and a lot of times it's about specific to his thinking or his reaction. And I get beat up a little bit for not always having asked that question, but it's a little hard to always read their minds and know all the questions that they're going to ask, so that I know all of the things I should check with him before I go out. Again, we try to do the very best job we can to get information. Sometimes it's from the president, sometimes it's from other members of the administration. For instance, if we know that there is a big legislative drive or legislative questions coming that day, we'll meet with the legislative affairs team and walk through some of the questions that we think are coming, so that we have a better idea of, you know, the background and the process. But the news of the day can really determine the individuals that we talk to and meet with and try to involve in briefing prep. But usually there have been a couple instances where I haven't spoken to the president just before, but usually I try to talk to the president before the briefing every day. And sometimes it's 3, 4, 5 times. Just again, it can vary depending on the day.
Do you hear from him after the briefing?
Sometimes.
Does he watch it?
Sometimes, not always.
Man, I tell you, if Clinton had watched my briefings, I would have been a dead man.
Particularly your gaggles.
This is a little bit of a sensitive question, but are you cleared into everything top secret, SCI?
I'm not allowed to talk about the security clearances. I don't know if you've been watching the briefings. It's been a pretty hot topic lately.
Well, look, I mean, my process was very similar.
Since I can't answer on anybody else, I want to answer on myself.
Yeah,
right
that's
in front of a large
a very judicious answer.
We were bad.
I know. At
the end here.
Actually, this is a critical point. We went. You know, I'd go down to what's that room where they have all the secrets down in the basement.
The situation room?
Situation.
Oh, I was like, wait, is there another room?
Yeah, right. I know it. Yeah.
Kind of like the
I was thinking, like,
bowling alley.
At the State Department, it's the operations center,
Yeah.
but at the White House, it's the situation room. And so I'd go down there, and I would actually read the National Intelligence Digest and the President's Daily Brief. And I didn't have access to that at first. I had to kind of like tell Sandy Berger, who is the NSA guy, that said, you know, I need to read this. And I'm not going to go blab anything I know. I just don't need to screw up by saying something is red when in fact it's gray. And that's the fatal thing for a press secretary, when you inadvertently say something that ends up being true because you didn't.
I don't know anything about that, Mike. Everything is.
Well,
Okay, I've got one last question here.
But I think it is a really critical thing in protecting the right. You know, I want to make a point about this. Clinton was really good about this. He would sometimes say, "Get Mike McCurry in here for this meeting because he needs to hear what we're talking about." He didn't expect me to have an opinion. He didn't expect me to go out and blab about it, but he wanted me to know what the contours of the debate were so I could then adequately, reflect what he was deciding. And that is a critical thing for a press secretary to have.
And you have that kind of access for whatever meetings you want?
I do, and for the most part, our team as a whole, particularly the chief of staff, has been incredibly good about bringing me in, particularly if there's going to be a meeting that's got a lot of press interest. I've been in the room a lot of times when the president goes on the Hill. I typically go with him, and I'm part of a lot of the meetings there because we know that there will be a lot of interest. It's a lot easier here to answer the questions if you can say, well, I was in the room and I saw X, Y, and Z.
Absolutely.
And I completely agree that access is incredibly important. And so far, I haven't had any moments where it's been a point of contention with the
Well,
president.
you
or
keep
certainly with the
at
chief
it
of
and
staff.
make the president make sure you're there.
He hasn't kicked me out yet.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, last question. Yesterday, the president tweeted that have a very reflective President's Day. And I wondered about both of your presidents in reflecting back on their first year, what they learned about communications.
Well, I was not there. I went
Oh, yeah,
to the
that's right.
Clinton administration after the first 2 years, and
We were in the State
he's
Department.
totally screwed up the first 2 years.
Until Mike showed up and got him on
Well,
the
no. I came in. I came in after he got hammered in the midterm election. You may have an opportunity to deal with that before too long.
Our numbers look pretty good. I'm all right.
But so we reconfigured the White House. Leon Panetta came in. He brought in a new thing. I came in. Had been at the State Department, so on and so forth. So there was a learning curve about how to adequately communicate. But I want to go back to my point is, it was the last century, and we had so fewer challenges in how to communicate than what this poor lady has to deal with day in and day out. In just the terms of the news cycle and the 24/7, the throbbing beat of things. And if we could get you and the journalists who are here to slow it down and let people, there's not like a big closet at the White House that is the truth closet and you get to open it up and there's the truth. It takes time. I mean, we have to work as reporters in some ways, as press secretaries, because we got to go like, okay, this secretary said that, and that secretary so-and-so said that, and we got to figure out, what is the truth? And then how do we accumulate the information, how we get it? Marlon Fitzwater, one of our predecessors, wrote in his book, he said the greatest challenge of the job of being White House press secretary is verification. How do you make sure that what you're going to go out and say is true? And how do you work the government and work different sources to really make sure that you know it's true? Now we have, unlike some of the reporters here, we have unlimited access to sources because we can call up a secretary and say, what the hell's going on about this? Or we can go read whatever we need to read.
Sometimes that goes over better than others.
But it is, as long as we are steering ourselves towards telling the truth. I got in trouble one time saying sometimes you have to tell the truth slowly because you can't tell everything you know, but you have to keep it going towards the truth and away from falsehood. And that's your challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Sarah, what do you think the president has learned in this past year about communications?
I think that one of the things he talked about when we were actually in Davos maybe a month ago is learning the differences of how you would approach something as a businessman versus as the president. And I think that's been a very big shift. And whereas as a businessman, the way that you process information and the way that you can make a decision and you can execute it very quickly, and in a lot of cases very unilaterally, is very different than how you can make decisions and implement them as a president. And you have to work within the confines of government, which can sometimes be very slow and difficult, versus in business where it can move a lot faster. And that was one of the things that he's talked about in a public way that took a little bit more time to work through that process. And so I think that's certainly one of the things that we've learned over the last year as an administration.
Well, thank you both very much. Our time is way past.
Well, I think everybody should stick around because I think you introduced the next panel as with the reporters letting us know where they're going to get their information from. I would actually like to know a lot of that information too, because of the sources that come from a lot of stories. I'm pretty interested, so I'm going to tune in and see if you guys drop names. I think that's perfectly okay. I think it's off the record, so you're safe. So feel free to be an open book and share as much as possible and as much as you feel comfortable with.
We maybe have not achieved the white flag of surrender in the war against the press, but I think Sarah is at least showing that she's trying to work it through. And it's a tough thing to do because it gets set, the tone gets set by the president. The president's going to have to ultimately be the one who changes the vocabulary.
Yeah.
But you're doing what you need to try to do to make things work.
The position of the press secretary is, I think, the second most difficult staff job after
chief of staff,
because you have.
Oh, by the way,
you have four
chief of staff.
Yeah, you have four constituents because you have the president, the press, you've got the White House staff, and you have the public. And so meeting all of those is very tough.
I mean, the last thing I know we're over time, but you know that office that we have, which is a great office. There's a back door and a front door. Mm-hmm. And the back door, you go out the back door, you turn right, you're in the Oval Office 50 feet away. You turn left, you're in the briefing room. And it's like, for me, the metaphor. You're halfway between the two groups, and you got to keep both of them happy.
Yeah, I was told that a lot of people didn't use the back door. I'm like, why not? Because all the reporters line up in the hall. If I go at the back door, I can sneak right past them, and it's a free shot down to the other side of the building. I don't know why it's not utilized more.
And Jody Powell had a refrigerator there that was stocked with beer most of the time he was there, but is that refrigerator still there? Probably not stocked.
No refrigerator in that office anymore. I don't know if we're supposed to have them in the West Wing these days. So. No phones, no refrigerators, no fun. I mean, we're really just buzzkill all around.
Thank you all very much.
That's fun.